the evening, where shadows softly play. A fairy tale wolf sheds his skin, gently drifting away, with a twinkle in his eye and a heart full of dreams. He waits for the Friday night glow, where the magic redeems. Oh, the wolf in the moonlight, he's found his true call, reading tales of wonder for one and for all. In a world of stars dancing, his spirit takes flight, with stories of beauty under the starlit night. He picks up the page.
Hello everyone, it is Friday. That means it is a night for fairy tales, because Fridays, according to Scottish lore, belong to the fairies. So anything done on a Friday also belongs to them. So tonight is for the fairies, and that's probably the best reason to read fairy tales. I do want to thank everyone for coming in, and I would also like to announce that Book 3, as far as the Kindle edition, has been approved. So I will need to finish putting together the covers for the paperback and hardback, and I will try to get them out as soon as I can. I will say that Book 3 starts with a very horrific story. It is probably the only one that hasn't been printed in large type, but it's one that I read probably at least 2 years ago on stream, called Children Who Play at Slaughter. If you can tell, it's kids killing each other, as, you know, part of trying to pretend to be adults. And that's folktales. That's how things go in these things. And if you saw the comments I put on Twitter, and I believe I also put it on Blue Sky, the count list I put on there is how many people die in this version of the book. And most of them from just one story. But let's not dwell on the darker side of fairy tales, because that wasn't really a fairy tale, it's more of a folk tale. But, you know, they get clumped together a lot. But I hope everyone has a wonderful week. And I just wanted to make sure that I did get the announcement done that Book 3 is out for Kindle. I said I need to edit the cover artwork, just change the title and put everything on it so I can finish doing all that work, but I got it done. I was up most of the last night and spent at least half of today working on it to try to get it finished. So that's one more thing checked off on the list for this year. Now I just need to get the follower goals on here and YouTube and see if the Moxie's Corner people finish the new model. We're taking the time to do a presentation video for it, which I don't really need. But, you know. And, I'm trying to start planning things on what to do for August 10th. Because that'll be my 4th anniversary of being a streamer. And I don't really know what to do. Every year I seem to go back to the same game and play more of the Black Book, but I don't have my subscription to Live active, so I can't really just go in and pull it up and remote stream it. But again, I hope everyone has had a wonderful week. I hope you continue to have a wonderful evening. But let's go ahead and skip over to the library. And we will get back into the Crimson Fairy book. So feel free to settle in. Got another couple of minutes. If you want to go get something to drink or get something to snack on, I don't mind. I like having lurkers here. I really appreciate all the lurkers because most of the time I'm so into the book I can't really notice that there's people chatting anyway. I'm trying to fix that. That's why I got the second monitor, so I can hold the book up and still see the chat screen. It's also why I spend a lot more time editing the videos for the VODs. That way I can still get the story done as read and still have a chance to interact with people. But remember, I do appreciate you all for just coming in, stopping by, dropping a lurk. If you're not actively watching, if you're listening, that's fine, because that's what stories are for. I wish I could fix my model, so maybe I have to fix my camera's location. My eyes are always drifting up. I don't know. And I do have the closed caption going. It doesn't always accurately post what I say. And even harder so when I'm doing fairy tales, because I get some really weird words in there. But feel free to settle back and just shut off your mind and picture the stories, as I will do my best to read them as properly as I can. And our first story for tonight, which is Romanian, Little Wildrose. Once upon a time, the things in this story happened, and if they had not happened, then the story would never have been told. But that was the time when wolves and lambs lay peacefully together in one stall, and shepherds dined on grassy banks with kings and queens. Once upon a time, then, my dear good children, there lived a man. Now this man was really 100 years old, if not fully 20 years more, and his wife was very old too. How old, I do not know, but some say she is as old as the goddess Venus herself. They had been happy all these years, but they would have been happier still if they had any children. But old though they were, they had never made up their minds to do without them, and often they would sit over the fire and talk of how they would have brought up their children if only some had come to their house. One day the old man seemed sadder and more thoughtful than the other common of him, and at last he said to his wife, "Listen to me, old woman." "What do you want?" she asked. Get me some money out of the chest, for I'm going on a long journey, although the world, to see if I cannot find a child, for my heart aches to think that after I am dead, my house will fall into the hands of a stranger. And this let me tell you, that if I never find a child, I shall not come home again. Then the old man took a bag and filled it with food and money, and throwing it over his shoulder, bade his wife farewell. For long he wandered and wandered and wandered, but no child did he see, and one morning his wanderings led him to a forest which was so thick that no light could pass through the branches. The old man stopped when he saw this dreadful place, and at first was afraid to go in, but he remembered that, after all, as the proverb says, it is the unexpected that happens, and perhaps in the midst of this black spot he might find the child he was seeking. So summoning up all his courage, he plunged boldly in. How long he might have been walking there he never could have told you, when at last he reached the mouth of a cave where the darkness seemed 100 times darker than the wood itself. Again he paused, but he felt as if something was driving him to enter, and with a beating heart he stepped in. For some minutes of silence and darkness so appalled him that he stood where he was, not daring to advance in one step. Then he made a great effort and went on a few paces, and suddenly, far before him, he saw a glimmer of light. This put new heart into him, and he directed his steps towards the faint rays till he could see, sitting by it, an old hermit with a long white beard. The hermit either did not hear the approach of the visitor, or pretended not to, for he took no notice, and continued to read his book. After waiting patiently for a little while, the old man fell on his knees and said, "Good morning, Holy Father." But he might as well have spoken to the rock. "Good morning, Holy Father," he said again, a little louder than before, and this time the hermit made a sign to him to come nearer. "My son," whispered he, in a voice that echoed through the cavern, "what brings you to the dark and dismal place? Hundreds of years have passed since my eyes have rested on the face of a man, and I did not think to look on one again." "My misery brought me here," replied the old man. "I have no child, and all our lives my wife and I have longed for one. So I left my home and went out into the world, hoping that somewhere I might find what I was seeking." Then the hermit picked up an apple from the ground and gave it to him, saying, "Eat half of this apple and give the rest to your wife, and cease wandering through the world." The old man stooped and kissed the feet of the hermit for sheer joy and left the cave. He made his way through the forest as fast as the darkness would let him, and at length he arrived in the flowery fields which dazzled him with their brightness. Suddenly he was seized with a desperate thirst and a burning in his throat. He looked for a stream, but none was seen, and his tongue grew more parched every moment. At length his eyes fell on the apple, which all this while he had been holding in his hand, and his thirst he forgot what the hermit had told him, and instead of merely eating his own half, he ate up the whole thing, the woman's half too, and after that he went to sleep. When he woke, he saw something strange lying on the bank a little way off, amidst long trails of pink roses. The old man got up and rubbed his eyes and went to see what it was, when, to his surprise and joy, it proved to be a little girl about 2 years old, with a skin as pink and white as the roses above her. He took her gently into his arms, and she did not seem frightened at all, but only jumped and crowed with delight, and the old man wrapped his cloak around her, and set off for home as fast as his legs could carry him. When they were close to the cottage where they lived, he laid the child on a pail that was standing near the door, and ran into the house, crying, "Come quickly, wife, quickly, for I have brought you a daughter with hair of gold and eyes like stars." At this wonderful news, the old woman flew downstairs, almost tumbling down, in her eagerness to see the treasure. When her husband led her to the pail, it was perfectly empty. The old man was nearly beside himself with horror, while his wife sat down and sobbed with grief and disappointment. There was not a spot round on which they did not search, thinking that somehow the child might have got out of the pail and hidden itself for fun. But the little girl was not there, and there was no sign of her. "Where can she be?" moaned the old man in despair. "Oh, why did I leave her, even for a moment? The fairies have taken her. Her has been carried off by some wild beast." And they began to search all over again, but neither fairies nor wild beasts did they meet with, and with sore hearts they gave it up at last, and turned sadly into the hut. And what had become of the baby? Well, finding herself alone in a strange place, she began to cry with fright, and an eagle hovering near heard her, and went to see what the sound came from. When he beheld the fat pink and white creature, he thought of his hungry little ones at home, and swooping down he caught her up in his claws, and was soon flying with her over the tops of the trees. In a few minutes he had reached the one in which he had built his nest, and laying little Wildrose, for the old man had called her, among his downy young eaglets, he flew away. The eaglets naturally were rather surprised at this strange animal, so suddenly popped down in their midst, but instead of beginning to try to eat her, as their father expected, they nestled up close to her and spread out their tiny wings to shield her from the sun. Now, in the depths of the forest where the eagle had built his nest, there ran a stream whose waters were poisonous, and on the banks of the stream dwelt a horrible lindworm with 7 heads. The lindworm had often watched the eagle flying about the top of the tree, carrying food to his young ones, and, accordingly, he watched carefully for his moment when the eaglets began to try their wings and fly away from the nest. Of course, if the eagle himself was there to protect them from the lindworm, big and strong as he was, he knew he could do nothing. But when he was absent, the little eaglets who ventured too near the ground would be sure to disappear down the monster's throat. Their brothers, who had been left behind, were too weak and young to see the world, and knew nothing of this. I suppose their turn would soon come to see the world also. And in a few days their eyes too opened, and their wings flapped impatiently, and they longed to fly above the waving treetops to mountain and the bright sun beyond. But that very midnight the lindworm, who was hungry and could not wait for his supper, came out of the brook with a rushing noise and made straight for the tree. 2 eyes of flame came creeping nearer and nearer, and 2 fiery tongues were stretching themselves closer and closer to the little birds who were trembling and shuddering in the furthest corner of the nest. But just as the tongues had almost reached them, the lindworm gave a fearful cry and turned and fell backwards. Then came the sound of battle from the ground below, and the trees shook, though there was no wind, and roars and snarls mixed together till the eaglets felt more frightened than ever, and thought that their last hour had finally come. Only Wildrose was undisturbed, and slept sweetly through it all. In the morning the eagle returned and saw traces of a fight below the tree, and here and there a handful of yellow mane lying about, and here and there a hard scaly substance. When he saw that, he rejoiced greatly, and hastened to his nest. "Oh, I slain the lindworm," he asked his children. There were so many that did not at first miss the 2 which the lindworm had eaten. But the eaglets answered that they could not tell, only that they had been in danger of their lives. At the last moment they had been delivered. Then the sunbeam had struggled through the thick branches and caught Wildrose's golden hair as she lay curled up in the corner, and the eagle wondered as he looked whether the little girl had brought him luck, and it was her magic which had killed his enemy. "Children," he said, "I brought you here for your dinner, and you have not touched her. What is the meaning of this?" But the eaglets did not answer, and Wildrose opened her eyes, and seemed 7 times lovelier than before. From that day, Wildrose lived like a princess. The eagle flew about the wood and collected the softest, greenest moss he could find to make her bed, and then he picked with his beak all the brightest and prettiest flowers in the fields or on the mountains to decorate it. So cleverly did he manage it that there was not a fairy in the whole of the forest who would not know had been pleased to sleep there, rocked to and fro by the breeze in the treetops. And when the little ones were able to fly from their nest, he taught them where to look for the fruits and berries which she loved. So the time passed by, and with each year Wildrose grew taller and more beautiful, and she lived happily in her nest and never wanted to go out of it, only standing at the edge on sunset and looking out upon the beautiful world. For company, she had all the birds of the forest, who came and talked to her, and for playthings the strange flowers which they brought her from far, and the butterflies which danced with her, and so the days slipped away until she was 14 years old. One morning the emperor's son went out to hunt, and he had not ridden far before a deer started from under a grove of trees and ran before him. The prince instantly gave chase, and where the stag led he followed, till at length he found himself in the depths of the forest where no man had trod before. The trees were so thick and the woods so dark that he paused for a moment and listened, straining his ears to catch some sound to break a silence which almost frightened him. But nothing came, not even the baying of a hound or the note of a horn. He stood still, wondering if he should go on, and looked up. A stream of light seemed to flow from the top of a tall tree. In its rays he could see the nest with the young eaglets who were watching him over the side. And the prince fitted an arrow into his bow and took his aim. But before he could let fly, another ray of light dazzled him. So brilliant was it that his bow dropped, and he covered his face with his hands. When at last he peeped up, Wildrose, with her golden hair flowing around her, was looking down at him. And this was the first time she had ever seen a man. "Can you tell me? Can I reach you?" he cried out. But Wildrose smiled and shook her head and sat down quietly. The prince saw that it was no use, and turned and made his way out of the forest. But he might as well have stayed there, for any good he was to his father, for so full was his heart of longing for Wildrose. Twice he returned to the forest in hopes of finding her, but this time fortune failed him, and he went home as sad as ever. At length the emperor, who could not think what caused this change, sent for his son and asked him what was the matter. Then the prince confessed that the image of Wildrose filled his soul, and that he would never be happy without her. At first the emperor felt rather disturbed. He doubted whether a girl from the treetop would make a good empress, but he loved his son so much that he promised to do all he could to find her. So the next morning heralds were sent forth throughout the whole land to inquire if anyone knew where a maiden could be found who lived in the forest on the top of a tree, and to promise great riches and a place in the court for any person who should find her. But nobody knew. All the girls in the kingdom had their homes on the ground, and laughed at the notion of being brought up in a tree. "A nice kind of empress she would make," they said, as the emperor had done, tossing their heads in disdain, and for having read many books they guessed what she was wanted for. The heralds were almost in despair when an old woman stepped out of the crowd and came and spoke to them. She was not only very old, but she was very ugly, with a hump on her back and a bald head. When the heralds saw her, they broke into a rude laughter. "I can show you the maiden who lives on the treetop," she said, but they only laughed all the louder. "Get away, old witch!" they cried. "You'll bring us bad luck." But the old woman stood firm and declared that she alone knew where to find the maiden. "Go with her," said the eldest of the heralds at last. "The Emperor's orders are clear, that whoever knew anything about the maiden was to come at once to court. Put her in the coach, and we'll take her with us." So in this fashion, the old woman was brought to court. "You have declared that you can bring hither the maiden from the wood," said the Emperor, who was seated in his throne. "Yes, your Majesty, and I will keep my word," said she. "Then bring her at once," said the Emperor. "Give me first a kettle and a tripod," asked the old woman, and the Emperor ordered them to be brought instantly. The old woman picked them up and tucked them under her arm and went on her way, keeping at a little distance behind the royal huntsmen, who in their turn followed the prince. Oh, what a noise that old woman made as she was walking along! She chattered to herself as fast and clattered the kettle so loudly you'd have thought a whole campful of gypsies must be coming round the next corner. But when she reached the forest, she bade them to wait outside and entered the dark wood by herself. She stopped underneath a tree where the maiden dwelt and gathered up some dry sticks and kindled a fire. Next, she placed the tripod over it and the kettle on top. But something was the matter with the kettle. As fast as the old woman put it where it was to stand, the kettle was sure to roll off, falling to the ground with a crash. It really seemed bewitched, and no one knows what might have happened if Wildrose, who had been all the time peeping out of her nest, had not lost patience with the old woman's stupidity and called out, "The tripod won't stand on the hill. You must move it." "But where am I to move it to, my child?" asked the old woman, looking up at the nest, and at the same moment trying to steady the kettle with one hand and the tripod with the other. "Didn't I tell you it was no good doing that?" said Wildrose, more impatiently than ever. "Make a fire near the tree and hang the kettle from one of the branches." The old woman took the kettle and hung it on a little twig, which broke at once, and the kettle fell to the ground. "If you would only show me how to do it, perhaps I should understand," said she. Quick as a thought, the maiden slid down the smooth trunk of the tree and stood beside the stupid old woman to teach her how things ought to be done. But in an instant the old woman had caught the girl and swung her over her shoulder and was running fast as she could to the edge of the forest, where she had left the prince. When he saw them coming, he rushed eagerly to meet them, and took the maiden in his arms and kissed her tenderly before them all. Then a golden dress was put on her, and pearls were twined in her hair, and she took her seat in the emperor's carriage, which was drawn by 6 of the whitest horses in the world, and they carried her, without stopping to draw breath, to the gates of the palace. And in 3 days the wedding was celebrated, and the wedding feast was held, and everyone who saw the bride declared that if anybody wanted a perfect wife, they must go seek her on top of a tree. So much to be said about that. I don't know how many times I've talked about kings finding naked women in the forest and marrying them. but this is the first time they've been in a bird's nest at the top of it, especially eagle's nest. And how did she learn to speak? She only had birds and butterflies to visit her. But then again, she was also born from a guy eating an apple, so we can't really get that far. Anyway. Shinish Mushroom. Not sure which country that was from. Ishnish. Ishnish. This is just night stories. Okay. I'm really trying to get better at German. I'm translating the stories for the book myself, so that's one of the reasons why it took a little bit longer. Anyway, our next story for this fabulous Friday night of fairy tales for the fairies. Tiidu the Piper. Once upon a time there lived a poor man who had more children than bread to feed them with. However, they were strong and willing, and soon learned to make themselves of use to their father and mother. And when they were old enough, they went out to service, and everyone was very glad to get them for servants, for they worked hard and were always cheerful. Out of the 10 or 11, there was only one who gave his parents any trouble, and this was a big, lazy boy whose name was Tiidu. Neither scoldings, nor beatings, nor kind words had any effect on him, and the older he grew, the idler he got. He spent his winters crouching close to the warm stove, and his summers asleep under a shady tree, and if he was not doing either of these things, he was playing tunes on his flute. One day he was sitting under a bush, playing so sweetly that you might have mistaken the notes for those of a bird, and when an old man passed by, "What trade do you wish to follow, my son?" he asked in a friendly voice, stopping as he did so in front of the youth. "If I were only a rich man and had no need to work," replied the boy, "I should not follow any. I could not bear to be anybody's servant, as my brothers and sisters all are." The old man laughed as he heard this answer and said, "But I do not exactly see where your riches are to come from if you do not work for them. Sleeping cats catch no mice. He who wishes to become rich must either use his hands or his head, and be ready to toil night and day, or else—" But the youth broke in rudely. "Oh, be silent, old man. I have told you that all 100 times, and it runs off me like water out of a duck's back. No one will ever make a worker out of me." "You have one gift," replied the old man, taking no notice of his speech, "and if you would only go about and play the pipes, you would easily earn not only your daily bread, but a little money into the bargain. Listen to me, set yourself a set of pipes, learn to play them as well as you do your own flute, and wherever there are men to hear you, I promise you will never lack money." Get into the gig economy. "Where am I to get the pipes from?" asked the youth. "Well, blow on your flute for a few days," replied the old man, "and you will soon be able to buy your pipes. By and by I will come back again to see if you have taken my advice, and whether you are likely to grow rich." And so saying, he went on his way. Tiidu stayed where he was a little longer, thinking of all the old man had told him, and the more he thought, the surer he felt that the old man was right. He determined to try whether his plan would really bring luck, but as he did not like being laughed at, he resolved not to tell anyone a word of it. So next morning he left home, and he never came back. His parents did not take his loss much to heart, but were very glad that their useless son had for once shown a little spirit, and they hoped that time and hardship would cure Tiidu of idle folly. For some weeks, Tiidu wandered from one village to another and proved for himself the truth of the old man's promise. The people he met were all kind and friendly, and enjoyed his flute playing, giving him his food in return, and even a few pence. These pence the youth hoarded carefully till he had collected enough to buy a beautiful pair of pipes. Then he felt himself indeed on the high road to riches. Nowhere could pipes be found as fine as his, or played in so masterfully a manner. Tiidu's pipes set everybody's legs dancing. Wherever there was a marriage, a christening, or any kind of feast, Tiidu must be there, or the evening would be a failure. In a few years he had become so noted a piper that people would travel far and wide just to hear him. One day he was invited to a christening where many rich men from a neighboring town were to be present, and all agreed that never in their lives had they heard such playing as his. They crowded round him and praised him and pressed him to come to their homes, declaring that it was a shame not to give their friends a chance to hear such wonderful music. Of course, this all delighted Tiidu, who accepted gladly, and left their houses laden with money and presents of every kind. One great lord clothed him in a magnificent dress, a second hung a chain of pearls around his neck, and a third handed him a set of new pipes encrusted in silver. As for the ladies, the girls twisted silver scarfs around his plumed hat, and their mothers knitted him gloves of all colors to keep out the cold. Any other man in Tiidu's place would have been contented and happy with his life, but his craving for riches gave him no rest, and only goaded him on day by day to fresh exertions, so that even his own mother would not have known him for the lazy boy who was always lying asleep in one place or another. Now Tiidu saw quite clearly that he could only hope to become rich by means of his pipes, and set about thinking if there was nothing he could do to make money flow in faster. At length he remembered having heard some stories of a kingdom in the Kungla country, where musicians of all sorts were welcomed and highly paid. But where was it, and how was it reached, he could not recollect. However, hard he thought. In despair, he wandered along the coast, hoping to see some ship sailing, or a boat that would take him to where he wished to go, and at length he reached the town of Narva, where several merchantmen were lying at anchor. To his great joy, he found that one of them was sailing for Kungla in a few days, and hastily he went on board and asked for the captain. But the cost of passage was more than the prudent Tiidu cared to pay, and though he played his best on his pipes, the captain refused to lower his price, and Tiidu was just thinking of returning on shore when his usual luck flew to his aid. A young sailor who had heard him play came secretly to him, and offered to hide him on board in the absence of a captain. So the next night, as soon as it was dark, Tiidu stepped on deck and was hidden by his friend down in the hold in a corner between two casks. Unseen by the rest of the crew, the sailor managed to bring him food and drink, and when they were all out of sight of land, he proceeded to carry out the plan he had invented to deliver Tiidu from his cramped quarters. At midnight, while he was keeping watch and everyone else was asleep, the man bade his friend Tiidu follow him on the deck, where he tied a rope to Tiidu's body, fastening the other end carefully to one of the ship's ropes. "Now," he said, "I will throw you into the sea, and you must shout for help. And when you see the sailors coming, untie the rope from your waist, and tell them that you have swum after the ship all the way from shore." At first, Tiidu did not much like this scheme, for the sea ran high, and he was a good swimmer, but the sailor reassured him that there was no danger. As soon as he was in the water, his friend hastened to rouse his mates, declaring that he was sure that there was a man in the sea following the ship. They all came on deck, and what was their surprise when they recognized a person who had bargained about a passage the previous day to the captain. "Are you a ghost or a dying man?" they asked him, trembling, as they stooped over the side of the ship. "I shall soon be a dead man if you do not help me," answered Tiidu, "for my strength is going fast." Then the captain seized the rope and flung it out to him, and Tiidu held it between his teeth, while, unseen by the sailors, he loosed the rope tied around his waist. "Where have you come from?" said the captain, when Tiidu was brought on board. "I followed you from the harbor," he answered, "and have been often in sore dread lest my life should fail me. I hoped that by swimming after the ship I might at least catch Kungla. I had no money to pay for passage." The captain's heart melted at these words, and he said kindly, "You may be thankful that you were not drowned. I will land you at Kungla free of payment, as you are so anxious to get there." So he gave him dry clothes to wear and a berth to sleep in. Tiidu and his friend secretly made merry over their cunning trick. For the rest of the voyage, the cruise ships treated Tiidu as something higher than themselves, seeing that in all their lives they had never met with a man who could swim for as many hours as he had done. This pleased Tiidu very much, though he knew that he had really done nothing to deserve it, and in return he delighted them by tunes on his pipes. When after some days they cast anchor at Kungla, and the story of his wonderful swim brought him many friends, for everybody wished to hear him tell the tale himself. This might have been all very well, had not Tiidu lived in dread that someday he would be asked to give proof of his marvelous swimming powers, but then everything would be found out. Meanwhile, he was dazzled with the splendor around him, and more than ever he longed for part of the riches, about which the owners seemed to care so little. He wandered through the streets for many days, seeking someone who wanted a servant, but though more than one person would have been glad to engage him, they seemed to Tiidu not the sort of people to get him rich quickly. At last, when he almost made up his mind that he must accept the next place offered to him, he happened to knock at the door of a rich merchant who was in need of a scullion, and gladly agreed to do the cook's bidding, and it was this merchant's house that he first learned how great riches were in the land of Kungla. All the vessels which in other countries were made of iron, copper, brass, or tin, in Kungla were made of silver or even gold. The food was cooked in silver saucepans, the bread baked in a silver oven, while the dishes and their covers were all of gold. Even the very pigs' troughs were silver too. But sight of these things only made Tiidu more covetous than before. "What is the use of all this wealth that I have constantly before my eyes," he thought, "if none of it is mine? I shall never grow rich by what means I earn as a scullion, even though I am paid as much in a month as I should get elsewhere in a year." By this time he had been in his place for 2 years, and had put quite a large sum of money. His passion of savings had increased to such a pitch that it was only by his master's orders that he ever bought any new clothes. "For," said the merchant, "I will not have dirty people in my house." So with a heavy heart Tiidu spent some of his next month's wages on a cheap coat. One day the merchant held a great feast in honor of the christening of his youngest child, and he gave each of his servants a handsome garment for the occasion. The following Sunday, Tiidu, who liked fine clothes when he did not have to pay for them, put on his new coat and went for a walk to some beautiful pleasure gardens, which were always full of people on a sunny day. He sat down under a shady tree and watched the passers-by, but after a little he began to feel rather lonely, for he knew nobody, and nobody knew him. Suddenly his eyes fell on the figure of an old man, which seemed familiar to him, though he could not tell when or where he had seen it. He watched the figure for some time, till at length the old man left the crowded paths, and threw himself on the soft grass under a lime tree, which stood at some distance from where Tiidu was sitting. Then the young man walked slowly past in order he might look at him more closely, and as he did so the old man smiled and held out his hand. "What have you done with your pipes?" asked he, and then in a moment Tiidu knew him. Taking his arm, he drew him into a quiet place and told him all that had happened since they last met. The old man shook his head as he listened, and Tiidu had finished his tale. He said, "You are a fool, and a fool you will always be. And there was ever such a silly folly as to exchange your pipes for a scullion's ladle. You could have made as much by your pipes in a day as your wages could come in half a year. Go home and fetch your pipes and play them here. You will soon see if I have spoken the truth. Tiidu did not like this advice. He was afraid that the people would laugh at him, and besides, it was long since he had touched his pipes. But as the old man persisted, and at last Tiidu did as he was told. "Sit down on the bank by me," said the old man when he came back, "and begin to play. In a little while people will flock around you." Tiidu obeyed, at first without much heart, but somehow the tone of his pipes was sweeter than he had remembered, and as he played the crowd ceased to walk and chatter, and stood still and silent around him. When he had played for some time, he took off his hat and passed it around for dollars, and silver coins and even gold pieces came tumbling in. Tiidu played a couple more tunes by the way of thanks, then turned to go home, hearing on all sides the murmurs, "What a wonderful piper! Come back, we pray you, next Sunday to give us another treat." "What did I tell you?" said the old man as they passed through the garden gate. "Was it not pleasanter to play for a couple hours on the pipes than to be stirring sauces all day? For a second time I've shown you the path to follow. Try to learn wisdom, and take the bull by the horns, lest your luck should slip from you. I can be your guide no longer, therefore listen to what I say and obey me. Go every Sunday afternoon to those gardens and sit under the lime tree and play to the people, and bring a felt hat with a deep crown, and lay it on the ground at your feet so that everyone can throw some money into it. If you are invited to play for a feast, willingly accept, but beware of asking a fixed price. Say you will take whatever they may feel inclined to give. You will get far more money in the end. Perhaps some day our cross may pass, and then I shall see how far you have followed my advice. Till then, farewell." And the old man went his way. As before, his words came true, though Tiidu could not at once do his bidding, as he was first to fulfill his appointed time of service. Meanwhile, he ordered some fine clothes, in which he paid every Sunday in the garden, and when he counted his gains in the evening, they were always more than the Sunday before. At length he was free to do as he liked, and he had more invitations to play than he could manage to accept. And at night, when the citizens used to go and drink at the inn, the landlord always begged Tiidu to come and play to them. Thus he grew so rich that very soon he had his silver pipes covered with gold, so that they glistened in the light of the sun or fire. In all of Kungla there was no prouder man than Tiidu. In a few years he had saved such a large sum of money that he was considered a rich man, even in Kungla, where everybody was rich. And then he had leisure to remember that he had once had a home and a family, and that he should like to see them again and show them how well he could play. This time he could not need to hide the ship's hold. He could hire the best cabin if he wished to, or even have a vessel all to himself. So he packed all his treasures in large chests and sent them on board the first ship that was sailing to his native land, and followed them with a light heart. The wind had started was fair, but soon freshened, and the night rose to a gale. For 2 days they ran before it, and hoped that by keeping well at sea they might be able to weather the storm, when suddenly the ship struck a rock and began to fill. Orders were given to lower the boats, and Tiidu with 3 sailors got into one of them, but before they could push away from the ship, a huge wave overturned it, and all 4 were flung into the water. Luckily for Tiidu, an oar was floating near him, and with its help he was able to keep on the surface of the water, and when the sun rose and the mist cleared away, he saw that he was not far from shore. By hard swimming, for the sea still ran high, he managed to reach it, and pulled himself out of the water, more dead than alive. Then he flung himself down to the ground, and fell fast asleep. When he awoke, he got up to explore the island, and see if there were any men upon it. But though he found streams and fresh fruits in abundance, there was no trace of either man or beast. Then, tired of his wanderings, he sat down and began to think. For the first time in his life, his thoughts did not instantly turn on money. It was not his lost treasure that dwelt his mind, but on his conduct of his parents, his laziness, his disobedience as a boy, his forgetfulness of them as a man. If wild beasts were to come here and tear me to pieces, he said to himself bitterly, it would only be what I deserve. My gains are all at the bottom of the sea. Well, lightly won, lightly lost. But it is odd that I feel that I should not care for that if only my pipes were left to me. Then he rose and walked a little further, till he saw a great tree with great red apples shining amongst the leaves. He pulled some down and ate them greedily. After that he stretched out on the soft moss and went to sleep. In the morning he ran to the nearest stream to wash himself, but to his horror, when he caught sight of his face, he saw his nose had grown the color of an apple and reached nearly to his waist. He started back, thinking he was dreaming, and put up his hand, but alas, the dreadful thing was true. Oh, why does not some wild beast devour me? He cried to himself. Never, never can I go again amongst my fellow men. Oh, if only the sea had swallowed me up, how much happier it would have been for me. And he hid his head in his hands and wept. His grief was so violent that it exhausted him, and growing hungry he looked about for something to eat. And just above him was a bough of ripe brown nuts, which he picked them and ate a handful. To his surprise, as he was eating them, he felt his nose grow shorter and shorter, and after a while he ventured to feel it with his hand, and even to look at the stream again. Yes, there was no mistake. It was as short as it was before, and perhaps a little shorter. In his joy at this discovery, Tiidu did a very bold thing. He took one of the apples out of his pockets and cautiously bit a piece of it. In an instant his nose was as long as his chin, and in deadly fear lest it should reach further, he hastily swallowed a nut, and waited in result for tearing. Supposing that shrinking his nose had only been an accident before, supposing that the nut and no other was able to cause the shrinking, if that case was that, by his own folly in not getting well alone, he could ruin his life completely. But no, he had guessed rightly, for no more time than his nose had taken to grow long did it return to its proper size. This may make my fortune, he said to himself joyfully. He gathered some apples, in which he put into one pocket, and a good supply of nuts, in which he put into the other. The next day he wove a basket out of some rushes, so that if he ever left the island he might be able to carry his treasures about. That night he dreamed of his friend. The old man appeared to him and said, Because you did not mourn for your lost treasure, and only for your pipes, I will give you news set to replace them. And behold, in the morning, when he got up, a set of pipes was lying in his basket. With what joy did he seize them, again one of his favorite tunes, and as he played, hope sprang up in his heart, and looked up to the sea, and tried to detect the sign of a sail. Yes, there it was, making straight for the island, and Tiidu, holding his pipes in his hands, dashed down to the shore. The sailors knew the island to be uninhabited, and were much more surprised to see a man standing on the beach, waving his arms, and to welcome them. A boat was put off, and two sailors rowed to the shore to discover how he came there, and if he wished to be taken away. Tiidu told him the story of his shipwreck, and the captain promised that he would come on board, and sail back with him to Kingla, and thankful indeed was Tiidu to accept the offer, and to show his gratitude by playing his pipes whenever he was asked to. They had a quick voyage, and it was not long before Tiidu found himself again in the streets of the capital of Kungla, playing as he went along. The people heard no music like his since he had went away, and they crowded around him, and in their joy gave him whatever money they had in his pockets. His first care was to buy himself some new clothes, which he sadly needed, taking care, however, that they should be made after a foreign fashion. When they were ready, he set out one day with a small basket of his famous apples and went to the palace. He did not have to wait long before one of the royal servants passed by and bought all the apples, begging as he did so that the merchant should return and bring some more. This Tiidu promised and hastened away as if he had been a mad bull behind him. So afraid was he that the man should begin to eat an apple at once. It's needless to say that for some days he took no more apples back to the palace, but kept well away on the other side of town, wearing other clothes, and disguised by a long black beard so that even his own mother would not have known him. The morning after his visit to the castle, the whole city was in an uproar about the dreadful misfortune that happened at the royal family. For not only the king and his wife and children had eaten strangers' apples and all, so said the rumor, were all very ill. The most famous doctors and greatest magicians were hastily summoned to the palace, but they shook their heads and came away again. Never had they met with such a disease in all the course of their experience. By and by the story went around town, and started no one knew how, that the malady was in some way connected with a nose, and men rubbed their own anxiously to be sure nothing was catching in the air. Matters had been in this state for more than a week when it reached the ears of the king that a man was living at the inn on the other side of town, who declared himself able to cure all manner of diseases. Instantly the royal carriage was commanded to drive with all speed back to bring this magician, offering him riches untold if he would restore their noses to their former lengths. Tiidu had expected this summons, and had been up all night changing his appearance, and so well that he succeeded that not a trace remained either of the piper or of the apple seller. He stepped into the carriage and was driven post haste to the king, who was feverishly counting every moment, for both his nose and his queen's were at the time more than a yard long, and they did not know where they would stop. Now, Tiidu thought it would not look well to cure the royal family by giving them raw nuts. He felt that might arouse suspicion. He had carefully pounded them into a powder, and divided the powder up into small doses, which were to be put on the tongue and swallowed at once. He gave one of these to the king and another to the queen, and told them that before taking them they were to get into bed in a dark room and not to move for some hours, after which they might be sure that they would come out cured. The king's joy was so great at this news that he would gladly have given Tiidu half the kingdom, but the piper was no longer so greedy of money as he once was, before he had been shipwrecked on the island. If he could get enough to buy a small estate and live comfortably on it for the rest of his life, that was all he cared for now. However, the king ordered his treasurer to pay him 3 times as much as he asked, and with this Tiidu went down to the harbor and engaged a small ship to carry him back to his native country. The wind was fair, and at 10 days the coast, which he had almost forgotten, stood clear before him. In a few hours he was standing in his old home, where his father, 3 sisters, and 2 brothers gave him a hearty welcome. His mother and his brothers had died some years before. When the meeting was over, he began to make inquiries about a small estate that was for sale near the town, and after he had bought it, the next thing he was to do was to find a wife to share it with. This did not take long either, and people were at the wedding feast declared. But the best part of the whole day was the hour when Tiidu played to them on the pipes before they bade each other farewell and returned to their homes. And that story kind of went all over the place. And ads are going to start pretty soon, so I will go ahead and say let's take a break. I will see you back in a few moments. Go stretch and relax, everyone. Get a drink. Do whatever you need to do. think the ads are over. Oh. Shit. My ads were over, but the ads on the YouTube that I get the sound effects from were not. But anyway, welcome back. I hope you got everything done during your break. I've been kind of curious whether or not Twitch actually plays the full 3 minutes of ads. Because I've noticed on other channels it'll say that it's going to be like a 2.5 minutes of ads, and it plays 1. But the timer still goes. So, I don't know. But anyway, our next story is apparently a Sicilian story that was translated into German and then translated back into English. So, expect weirdness. Our next story for this evening, Paperarelloo. Once upon a time there lived a king and a queen who had one son. The king loved the boy very much, but the queen, who was a wicked woman, hated the sight of him. And this was more unlucky, for when he was 12 years old, his father died, and he was left alone in the world. Now the queen was very angry because of the people who knew how bad she was, seated her son on the throne instead of herself, and she never rested till she had formed a plan to get rid of him. Fortunately, however, the young king was wise and prudent, and knew her too well to trust her. One day, when his mourning was over, he gave orders that everything should be made ready for a grand hunt. The queen pretended to be greatly delighted that he was going to amuse himself once more, and declared that she would accompany him. "No, mother, I cannot let you come," he answered. "The ground is rough, and you are not strong." But he might have well spoken to the winds. When the horn was sounded at daybreak, the queen was there with the rest. That day they rode, for game was plentiful, but towards evening the mother and son found themselves alone in part of the country that was strange to them. They wandered for some time without knowing where they were going, till they met with a man whom they had begged to give them shelter. "Come with me," said the man gladly, for he was an ogre and fed on human flesh, and the king and his mother went with him, and he led them to his house. When they got there, they found what a dreadful place they had come, and falling on their knees, they offered him great sums of money if only he would spare their lives. The ogre's heart was moved by the sight of the queen's beauty, and he promised that he would do her no harm. But he stabbed the boy at once, and binding the body on his horse, turned him loose in the forest. The ogre had happened to choose a horse which he had bought only the day before, and he did not know that it was a magician, or he would have not been so foolish as to fix upon it on this occasion. The horse no sooner had been driven off with the prince's body on its back, and he galloped straight to the home of the Faeries, and knocked at the door with his hoof. The Faeries heard the knock, but were afraid to open until they had peeped from an open window to see that it was no giant or ogre who would do them harm. "Look, sister," cried the first to reach the window. "It's a horse that is knocked, and on its back there is bound a dead boy, the most beautiful boy in the world." Then the Faeries ran to the door, and let the horse and unbound the ropes which fastened the young king on its back. They gathered round to admire his beauty, and whispered to one another, "Will we make him alive again? Will we keep him for our brother?" And so they did, and for many years they all lived together as brothers and sisters. By and by, the boy grew into a man, as boys will, and the oldest of the fairies said to her sisters, "Now I will marry him, and he shall be really your brother." So the young king married the fairy, and they lived happily together in the castle, but though he loved his wife, he still longed to see the world. Boys. At length his longing grew so strong on him that he could bear it no more, and calling the fairies together, he said to them, "Dear wife and sisters, I must leave you for a time, and go out to see the world. But I shall think of you often, and one day I shall come back to you." The fairies wept and begged him to stay, but he would not listen, and at last the eldest, who was his wife, said to him, "If you really will abandon us, take this lock of my hair with you. You will find it useful in time of need." So she cut off a long curl and handed it to him. The prince mounted his horse and rode on the day without stopping once. Towards evening he found himself in a desert, and look where he would, there was no such thing as a house or a man to be seen. "What am I to do now?" he thought. "If I go to sleep where wild beasts will come and eat me. Yet both I and my horse are worn out and can go no further." Suddenly he remembered the fairy's gifts, and taking out the crow, said to it, "I want a castle here, and servants, and dinner, and everything to make me comfortable tonight. Besides that, I must have a stable and fodder for my horse." And in a moment the castle was before him, just as he had wished. In this way he traveled through many countries, till at last he came to a land that was ruled by a great king. Leaving his horse outside the walls, he clad himself in the dress of a poor man, and went up to the palace. The queen, who was looking out of the windows, saw him approaching, and filled with pity, sent a servant to ask who he was and what he wanted. "I am a stranger here," answered the young king, "and very poor, and have come to beg for some work." "We have everyone we want," said the queen, when the servants told her the young man's reply. "We have a gatekeeper and a hall porter, and the servants of all sorts in the palace. The only person we have not got is a goose boy. Tell him that he can be our goose boy if he likes." The youth answered that he was quite content to be a goose boy, and that is how he got his name of Paperarelloo. And in order that no one should guess that he was better than a goose boy should be, he rubbed his face and his rags over with mud, and made himself altogether such a disgusting object that everyone who crossed over to the other side of the road, when he was seen coming. "Go and wash yourself, Paperarelloo," said the queen sometimes, for he did his work so well that she took an interest in him. "I would not feel comfortable if I was clean, your majesty," answered he, and went whistling after his geese. It happened one day that, owing to some accident to the great flour mills which supplied the city, there was no bread to be had, and the king's army had to do without. When the king heard of it, he sent for a cook and told him that by the next morning he must have all the bread in the oven, heated 7 times over, to bake. "But, your majesty, it's not possible," cried the poor man in despair. "The mills have only just begun working, and the flour will be ground till evening, and how can I heat the oven 7 times in one night?" "That is your affair," answered the king, and when he took anything into his head, he would listen to nothing else. "If you succeed in breaking the bread, you will have my daughter to wife, but if you fail, your head shall pay for it." Now, Paperarelloo, who was passing through the hall where the king was giving his orders, heard these words and said, "Your majesty, have no fear, I will bake your bread." "Very well," answered the king, "but if you fail, you will pay the price with your head," and signed that both should leave his presence. The cook was still trembling with the thought of what he had escaped, but to his surprise Paperarelloo did not seem disturbed at all, and when night came he went to sleep as usual. "Paperarelloo," cried the other servants when they saw him quietly taking off his clothes, "you cannot go to bed. You'll need every moment of the night with your work. Remember, the king is not to be played with. I really must get some sleep first, replied Paperarelloo, stretching himself and yawning, and he flung himself on his bed, and was fast asleep in a moment. In an hour's time the servants came and shook him by the shoulder. Paperarelloo, are you mad? They said. Get up or you will lose your head. Oh, do let me sleep a little more, answered he, and this was all he would say, though the servants returned to wake him many other times that night. At last the dawn broke, and the servants rushed to his room, crying, Paperarelloo, Paperarelloo, get up, the king is coming. You've baked no bread, and his surety will have your head. Oh, don't scream so, replied Paperarelloo, jumping out of bed as he spoke, and taking a lock of hair in his hand. He went into the kitchen, and behold, there stood bread piled high, 4, 5, 6 ovens full, and the seventh still waiting to be taken out of the oven. The servant stood and stared in surprise. The king said, Well, Paperarelloo, you have won my daughter. And he thought to himself, This fellow must be a magician. But the princess heard what was in store for her. She wept bitterly and declared that never, never would she weary the dirty Paperarelloo. However, the king paid no heed to her tears and prayers, and before many days were over, the wedding was celebrated with great splendor, though the bridegroom had not taken the trouble to wash himself, and was as dirty as before. When night came, he went as usual to sleep among his geese, and the princess went to the king and said, Father, I entreat you not to have the horrible... Father, I entreat you to have the horrible Paperarelloo put to death. No, no, replied her father. He is a great magician, and before I put him to death, I must first find out the secret of his power, and then we shall see. Soon after this, a war broke out, and everybody about the palace was very busy polishing up armor and sharpening swords, for the king and his sons were to ride at the head of the army. Then Paperarelloo left his geese and came and told the king that he wished to go and fight also. The king gave him leave and told him that he might go to the stable to take any horse he liked from the stalls. So Paperarelloo examined the horses carefully, but instead of picking one out of the splendid groomed creatures, whose skin shone like satin, he chose the poor lame thing and put a saddle on it, and rode after the other men-at-arms who were attending the king. In a short time he stopped and said to them, My horse can go no further. You must go to the war without me. I'll stay here and make little clay soldiers, and we'll play at battle. The men laughed at him for being so childish, and rode on after their master. Scarcely were they out of sight, and Paperarelloo took out his curl and wished himself the best armor, the sharpest sword, and the swiftest horse in the world. The next minute was riding as fast as he could through the battlefield. The fight had already begun, and the enemy was getting the best of it, when Paperarelloo rode up, and in a moment fortune's day had changed. Right and left a strange knife laid about. The sword pierced the stoutest breastplate and the strongest shield. It was indeed a host in himself, and his foes fled before thinking he was only the first of a troop of such warriors whom no one could stand. When the battle was over, the king sent for him to thank him for his timely help and to ask what reward he should give him. Nothing but your little finger, your majesty, was his answer. And the king cut off his little finger and gave it to Paperarelloo, who bowed and hid it in his surcoat. Then he left the field, and when the soldiers rode back, they found him still sitting in the road, making little rows of clay soldiers. The next day the king went out to fight another battle, and again Paperarelloo appeared, mounted the lame horse. As on the day before, he halted in the road, and made down to his clay soldiers. Then a second time he wished himself armor, sword, and horse, all sharper and better than those he had previously had, and galloped after the rest. He was only just in time. The enemy had almost beaten the king's army back, and the men whispered to each other that if only the strange knight did not come soon to their aid, they would all be dead. Suddenly someone cried, Hold a little longer. I see him in the distance. His armor shines brighter and his horse runs swifter than yesterday. Then they took a fresh heart and fought desperately on until a knight came up and threw himself into the thick of the battle. As before, the enemy gave way before him. In a few moments, the victory remained with the king. The first thing the victor did was to send for the knight to thank him for his timely help and ask which gifts he could bestow upon him as a token of gratitude. "Your Majesty's ear," answered the knight, and as the king could not go back on his word, he cut it off and gave it to him. Paperarelloo bowed and fastened the ear inside his surcoat and rode away. In the evening, when they all returned from the battle, there he was, sitting on the road, making clay dolls. On the third day, the same thing happened. At this time, he asked for the king's nose as a reward for his aid. Now, to lose one's nose is even worse than losing one's ear or one's finger. The king hesitated as to whether he should comply. However, he had always prided himself on being an honorable man, so he cut off his nose and handed it to Paperarelloo. Paperarelloo bowed and put the nose in his surcoat and rode away. In the evening, when the king returned from the battle, he found Paperarelloo sitting in the road, making clay dolls. And Paperarelloo got up to him and said, "Do you know who I am? I am your dirty goose boy, yet you have given me your finger, your ear, and your nose." That night, when the king sat at dinner, Paperarelloo came in, and laying down his ear, the nose, and the finger on the table, turned and said to the nobles and courtiers who were waiting on the king, "I am the invincible knight who rode 3 times to your help, and I am also a king's son, and no goose boy as you think." And he went away and washed himself, and dressed himself in fine clothes, and entered the hall again, looking so handsome that the proud princess fell in love with him on the spot. But Paperarelloo took no notice of her, and said to the king, "It was kind of you to offer me your daughter in marriage, and for that I thank you. But I have a wife at home who I love better, and it is her that I am going. But as a token of farewell, I wish that your ear, your nose, and finger may be restored to their proper places." So saying, he bade them all goodbye, and went back to his home and his fairy bride, with whom he lived happily till the end of his life. Okay. So, I like that one. Actually, a good young king who didn't cheat on his fairy wife, because that would have probably been very bad to do. Sicilians have rough fairy tales. But it's not the first time that kind of thing's happened in a fairy tale. The first one that he's ever had the king to face himself that I can remember. Literally, to face himself. Okay, this one... Oh, the next one is Finnish. That's going to be fun. Because they can be kind of harsh, too. So our next story for this evening, The Gifts of the Magician. Once upon a time there was an old man who lived in a little hut in the middle of the forest. His wife was dead, and he had only one son whom he loved dearly. Near their hut was a group of birch trees in which some black game had made their nests, and the youth had often begged his father permission to shoot the birds, but the old man strictly forbade him from doing anything of the kind. One day, however, when the father had gone a little distance to collect some sticks for fire, the boy fetched his bow and shot it at a bird that was just flying towards its nest. But he had not taken proper aim, and the bird was only wounded, fluttering along the ground. The boy ran to catch it, but though he ran fast, the bird seemed to flutter along very slowly. He could never quite come up to it. It was always just a little bit ahead. But so absorbed was he in the chase that he did not notice that for some time that he was now deep in the forest, in a place where he had never been before. Then he felt it would be foolish to go any further, and he returned to find his way home. Though he thought it would be easy enough to follow the path along which he had come, but somehow it was always branching off in unexpected directions. He looked about for a house where he might stop and ask his way, but there was not a sign of one anywhere, and he was afraid to stand still, for it was cold, and there were many stories of wolves being seen in that part of the forest. Night fell, and as he was beginning to start at every sound, and suddenly a magician came running towards him, with a pack of wolves snapping at his heels. Then all the boy's courage returned to him. He took his bow, and aiming a shot at the largest wolf, shot him through the heart, and a few more arrows were soon put rest to flight. The magician was full of gratitude to his deliverer, and promised a reward for his help if the youth would go back with him to his house. "Indeed, there's nothing that would be more welcome to me than a night's lodging," said the boy. "I've been wandering all day in the forest and did not know how to get home again." "Oh, come with me. You must be hungry and tired," said the magician, and led his way to his house, where the guest flung himself on a bed and went fast asleep. But his host returned to the forest to get some food, for his larder was empty. While he was absent, the housekeeper went to the boy's room and tried to wake him. He stamped the floor and shook him and called him, telling him that he was in great danger and must take flight at once. But nothing would rouse him, and if he didn't ever open his eyes, he shut them again directly. Soon after, the magician came back from the forest and told the housekeeper to bring them something to eat. The meal was quickly ready, and the magician called to the boy to come down and eat it. But he could not be wakened, and they had to sit down to supper without him. By and by the magician went out again to the wood for some more hunting, and he returned. He tried afresh to wake the youth, but finding it quite impossible, he went back for a third time into the forest. While he was absent, the boy woke and dressed himself. Then he came downstairs and began to talk to the housekeeper. The girl had heard how he had saved her master's life, so she said nothing more about his running away, but instead told him that if the magician offered him a choice reward, he was asked for the horse which stood in the third stall of the stable. By and by the old man came back, and they all sat down to dinner. When they had finished, the magician said, "Now, my son, tell me what you will have as a reward for your courage." "Give me the horse that stands in the third stall of your stable," answered the youth, "for I have a long way to go before I get home, and my feet will not carry me that far." "Ah, my son," replied the magician, "it is the best horse in my stable that you want. Will you not accept anything to please you?" But the boy declared that it was the horse, and the horse only, that he desired, and in the end the old man gave him away. And besides the horse, the magician gave him a zither, a fiddle, and a flute, saying that if you are in danger, touch the zither. If no one comes to your aid, then play on the fiddle. But if that brings no help, blow on the flute. The youth thanked the magician, and fastening his treasures about him, he mounted his horse and rode off. He had already gone some miles when, to his great surprise, the horse spoke, and said, "It is no use returning you home right now. Your father will only beat you. Let us visit a few towns first, and something lucky will be sure to happen to us." This advice pleased the boy, for he felt himself almost a man by this time, and thought it was high time that he saw the world. When they entered the capital of the country, everybody stopped to admire the beauty of the horse. Even the king heard of it and came to see the splendid creature with his own eyes. Indeed, he wanted directly to buy it, and the youth would give him any price he liked. The young man hesitated for a moment, but before he could speak, the horse contrived to whisper to him, "Do not sell me to the king, but ask the king to make me to a stable and feed me there.
and his other horses will become just as beautiful as I am.
The king was delighted when he was told what the horse had said, and took the animal at once to the stables and placed it in his own particular stall. Sure enough, the horse had scarcely eaten a mouthful of corn out of the manger, when the rest of the horses seemed to have undergone a transformation. Some of them were old favorites which the king had ridden in many wars, and they bore the signs of age and service. But now they arched their heads and pawed the ground with their slender legs, as they had been wont to do in days long gone by. The king's heart beat with delight, but the old groom who had had to take care of the horses stood crossly by, and eyed the owner of this wonderful creature with hate and envy. Not a day passed without his bringing some story against the youth to his master, but the king understood all about the matter, and paid no attention. At last the groom declared that the young man had boasted that he could find the king's war-horse which had strayed into the forest several years ago, and had not been heard of since. Now the king never ceased to mourn for his horse, so this time he listened to the tale which the groom had invented, and sent for the youth.
"Find me my horse in 3 days," he said, "or it will be the worse for you."
The youth was thunderstruck at this command, but he only bowed and went off at once to the stable.
"Don't worry yourself," answered his horse. "Ask the king to give you 100 oxen, and let them be killed and cut into small pieces. Then we will start on our journey and ride till we reach a certain river. There a horse will come up to you, but take no notice of him. Soon another will appear, and this you must also leave alone. When the third horse shows itself, throw my bridle over it."
Everything happened just as the horse had said, and the third horse was safely bridled. Then the other horse spoke again.
"The magician's raven will try to eat us as we ride away. Throw it some of the oxen's flesh, and then we will gallop like the wind and carry you safely out of the dragon's clutches."
Is it a dragon or a raven? A raven dragon. So the young man did as he was told, and brought the horse back to the king. The old stableman was very jealous when he heard of it, and wondered what he could do to injure the youth in the eyes of the royal master. At last he hit upon a plan, and told the king that the young man had boasted that he could bring home the king's wife, who had vanished many months before without leaving a trace behind her. Then the king bade the young man to come into his presence, and desired him to fetch the queen home again, as he boasted he could do. And if he failed, his head would pay the penalty. The poor youth's heart stood still as he listened. Find the queen? How was he to do that, when nobody in the palace had been able to do so? Slowly he walked to the stable, and laying his head on his horse's shoulder, said, "The king has ordered me to bring his wife home again. How can I do that when she disappeared so long ago, and no one can tell me anything about her?"
"Oh, cheer up," answered the horse. "We will manage to find her. You have only to ride me back to the same river we went to yesterday, and I will plunge into it and take my proper shape again. For I am the king's wife, who has turned into a horse by the magician from whom you saved me."
Joyfully, the young man sprang into the saddle and rode away to the banks of the river. Then he threw himself off and waited while the horse plunged in. The moment it dipped its head into the water, its black skin vanished, and the most beautiful woman in the world was floating in the water. She came smiling towards the youth and held out her hand, and he took it and led her back to the palace. Great was the king's surprise and happiness when he beheld his lost wife standing before him, and in gratitude to her rescuer he loaded him with gifts. You thought after that the poor youth would have been left in peace, but no. His enemy, the stableman, hated him as much as ever, and laid a new plot for his undoing. This time he presented himself before the king, and told him that the youth was so puffed up with what he had done that he declared he would seize the king's throne for himself. At this news the king waxed so furious that he ordered the gallows to be erected at once, and the young man to be hanged without a trial. He was not even allowed to speak in his own defense, but on the very steps of the gallows he sent a message to the king and begged, as a last favor, that he might play a tune on his zither. Leave was given him, and taking the instrument from under his cloak, he touched the strings. Scarcely had the first note sounded, than the hangman and his helper began to dance. And louder grew the music, the higher they capered, till at last they cried for mercy. But the youth paid no heed, and the strings rang out more merrily than before. By the time the sun had set, they both sank to the ground exhausted, and declared that the hanging must be put off until tomorrow. The story of the zither soon spread through the town, and on the following morning the king and his whole court and a large crowd of people were gathered at the foot of the gallows to see the youth hanged. Once more he asked for a favor, permission to play on his fiddle, and this the king was graciously pleased to grant. With the first few notes, the leg of every man in the crowd was lifted high, and they danced to the sound of the music the whole day till darkness fell, and there was no light to hang the musician by. The third day, the youth asked the leaf to play his flute. "No, no," said the king. "You made me dance all day yesterday, and if I do it again, it certainly be my death. You shall play no more tunes. Quick, the rope around his neck." At these words, the young man looked so sorrowful that the courtiers said to him, "Oh, he is very young to die. Let him play a tune if it will make him happy." So, very unwillingly, the king gave him leave, but first he had himself bound to a big fig tree, for fear that he should be made to dance. When he was made fast, the young man began to blow softly into his flute, and bound though he was, the king's body moved to the sound, up and down the fir tree till his clothes were in tatters, and the skin nearly rubbed off his back. But the youth had no pity and went on blowing, till suddenly the old magician appeared and asked, "What danger are you in, my son, that you have sent for me?" "They want to hang me," answered the young man. "The gallows are all ready, and the hangmen are only waiting for me to stop playing." "Well, I will put that right," said the magician, taking the gallows, and he tore it up and flung it into the air, and no one knew where it came down. "Who ordered you to be hanged?" he said. The young man pointed at the king, who was now bound to the fir, and without wasting words, the magician took hold of the tree also, and with a mighty heave, both fir and man went spinning through the air, and vanished in the cloud before the gallows. Then the youth was declared to be free, and the people elected him for their king, and the stable helper drowned himself from envy, for, after all, if it had not been for him, the young man would have remained poor all the days of his life. The horse was the queen. That the magician had turned her into a horse. Yeah, I'm not even sure what to say about that one. That wouldn't sound perverse. So, instead, let's get to the third. Well, what is this? Fifth story, I think. Anyway, it'll probably be the last story for the night, depending on how long it takes me. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Yep. So, it's probably our final story for the evening. The Strong Prince. Once upon a time there lived a king who was so fond of wine that he could not go to sleep unless he knew he had a great flaskful tied to his bedpost. All day long he drank till he was stupid to attend to business, and everything in the kingdom went to rack and ruin. But one day an accident happened to him, and he was struck on his head by a falling bough, so that he fell from his horse and lay dead upon the ground. Don't drink and ride. His wife and his son mourned his loss bitterly, for, in spite of his faults, he had always been kind to them. So they abandoned the crown and forsook their country, not knowing or caring where they went. At length they wandered into a forest, and being very tired, sat down under a tree to eat some bread that they had brought with them. When they had finished, the queen said, "My son, I am thirsty. Fetch me some water." The prince got up at once and went to the brook, which he heard gurgling near his hand. He stooped and filled his hat with the water, which he brought to his mother, and then he turned and followed the stream up to its source in a rock, where it bubbled out clear and fresh and cold. He knelt down to take a draught from the deep pool below the rock, when he saw his reflection of a sword hanging from a branch of the tree over his head. The man drew back with a start, but in a moment he climbed the tree, cut the rope that held the sword, and carried the weapon back to his mother. The queen was greatly surprised at the sight of anything so splendid in such a lonely place, and took it in her hands to examine it closely. It was of curious workmanship, wrought with gold, and on its handle was written, "The man who can buckle within the sword will become stronger than other men." The queen's heart swelled with joy as she read these words, and she bade her son lose no time in testing the truth. So he fastened it round his waist, and instantly a glow of strength seemed to run through his veins. He took a hold of a thick oak tree and rooted it as easily as if it had been a weed. This discovery put new life in the queen and her son, and they continued on their walk through the forest. But night was drawing on, and the darkness grew so thick that it seemed as if it could be cut with a knife. They did not want to sleep in the wood, for they were afraid of wolves and wild beasts, so they groped their way along, hand in hand, till the prince tripped over something which lay across the path. He could not see what it was, but he stooped down and tried to lift it. The thing was very heavy, and he thought his back would break under the strain. At last, with a great heave, he moved it out of the road, and as it fell, he knew it to be a huge rock. Behind the rock was a cave, which was quite clear was the home of some robbers, though not one of the band was there. Hastily putting out the fire, which burned brightly at the back, and bidding his mother come in and keep very still, the prince began to pace up and down, listening for the return of the robbers. But he was very sleepy, and in spite of all his efforts, he felt he could not keep awake much longer. When he heard the sound of the robbers returning, shouting and singing as they marched along. Soon the singing ceased, and straining his ears he heard them discussing anxiously what had become of their cave, and why they could not see the fire as usual. "This must be the place," said a voice, which the prince took to be that of the captain. "Yes, I feel the ditch before the entrance. Someone forgot to pile up the fire before we left, and it's burnt itself out. But it is all right. Every man jump across, and needs not cry out. Hop, I'm here. I will go last. Now begin." The man who stood nearest jumped across. He had no time to call the call which the captain had ordered, for with one swift, silent stroke of the prince's sword, his head rolled into the corner. And the young man cried and said, "Hop, I'm here." The second man, hearing the signal, leapt to the ditch in confidence, and was met with the same fate. In a few minutes 11 of the robbers lay dead, and there remained only the captain. Now the captain had wound around his neck a shawl of his lost wife, and the stroke of the prince's sword fell harmless. Being very cunning, however, he made no resistance, and rolled over as if he were dead as the other men. Still, the prince was no fool, and wondered if he had indeed was dead as he seemed to be, but the captain lay so stiff and stark that at last he was taken in. The prince next dragged the headless bodies into the chamber of the cave, and locked the door. Then he and his mother ransacked the place for some food, and when they had eaten it all, they lay down and slept in peace. When the dawn they were both awake again, and found that, instead of the cave which they thought they had come to the night before, they were now in a splendid castle, rooms full of beautiful things. The prince went around all of these and carefully locked them up, bidding his mother take care of the keys while he was hunting. Unfortunately, the queen, like all women, could not bear to think that there was anything which she did not know. It's in the book. That's how the story's written. Don't blame me. So the moment that her son had turned his back, she opened the doors to all the rooms and peeped in, till she came to the one where the robbers lay. But if the sight of the blood on the ground turned her faint, the sight of the robber captain walking up and down was a greater shock still. She quickly turned the key in the lock and ran back to the chamber that she had slept in. Soon after her son came in, bringing with him a large bear which he had killed for supper, as soon as there was food enough to last them for many days. The prince did not hunt the next morning, but instead began to explore the castle. He found that a secret way led from it into the forest, and following the path, reached another castle larger and more splendid than the one belonging to the robbers. He knocked at the door with his fist, and said that he wanted to enter. But the giant, to whom the castle belonged, only answered, "I know who you are. I have nothing to do with robbers." "I'm no robber," answered the prince. "I'm the son of a king, and have killed all the band. If you do not open to me at once, I will break in the door, and your head shall go join the others." He waited a little, but the door remained shut tightly as before. But then, just as he was to shoulder to it, it immediately began to crack. Then the giant found that it was no use keeping it shut, and opened it, saying, "I see you are a brave youth. Let there be peace between us." And the prince was glad to make peace, for he caught a glimpse of the giant's beautiful daughter, and from that day he often sought the giant's house. Now the queen led a dull life alone in the castle, and to amuse herself she paid visits to the robber captain, who flattered her till at last she agreed to marry him. But as she was much afraid of her son, she told the robber that the next time the prince went to bathe in the river, he was to steal the sword from its place in the bed, for without it the young man would have no power to punish him for his boldness. The robber captain thought this was good counsel, and the next morning, when the young man went to bathe, he unhooked the sword from its nail and buckled it round his waist. On his return to the castle, the prince found the robber waiting for him on the steps, waving the sword above his head, and knowing that some horrible fate was in store, fell on his knees and begged for mercy. But he might as well have tried to squeeze blood out of his tongue. The robber indeed granted him his life, but took out both his eyes, which he thrust into the prince's hand, brutally saying, "Here, you had better keep them. You may find them useful." Weeping, the youth felt his way to the giant's house and told him the story. The giant was full of pity for the young man, but inquired anxiously what he had done with the eyes. The prince drew them out of his pocket and silently handed them to the giant, who washed them well, then put them back into the prince's head. For 3 days he lay in utter darkness, then the light began to come back, till soon he saw as well as ever. But he thought he could not rejoice enough over the recovery of his eyes. He bewailed bitterly the loss of his sword, and that it should have fallen to the lot of his bitter enemy. "Never mind, my friend," said the giant. "I will get it back for you." And he sent for the monkey, who was his head servant. "Tell the fox and the squirrel that they are to go with you, and fetch back me the prince's sword." The 3 servants set out at once, one seated on the back of the other. The ape, who disliked walking, generally rode on top. Directly they came to the window of the robber's room, the monkey sprang from the back of the fox and squirrel and climbed in. The room was empty, and the sword hanging from the nail. He took it down and buckled it around his waist, as he had seen the prince do, and swung himself down, and mounting on the back of his 2 companions, hastened back to his master. The giant bade him to give the sword to the prince, who girded himself with, and returned with all speed to the castle. "Come out, you rascal! Come out, you villain!" he cried, "and answer to me for the wrong you have done. I will show you who is master of this house." The noise he made brought the robber into the room. He glanced to where the sword usually hung, but it was gone, and instinctively he looked at the prince's hand, where he saw it gleaming brightly. In his turn, he fell on his knees and begged for mercy, but it was too late. As he had done to the prince did to him, and blinded, was thrust forth and down a deep hole, where he is to this day. His mother the prince sent back to her father, and would never see her again. After this, he returned to the giant and said to him, "My friend, one more kindness to those who have already heaped up on me. Give me your daughter as my wife." So they were married, and the wedding feast was so splendid that there was not a kingdom in the world that did not hear of it. And the prince never went back to his father's son, but lived peacefully with his wife in the forest, where, if they are not dead, they are living still. Okay then. So many things in that story that could go on. But, again, thank you all for coming in and listening to me ramble and tell fairy tales. Let's see. Well, I know who's on. If anyone has any suggestions for rating, by all means, let me know. If there aren't any suggestions, I've already got a pretty good idea of what I want to rate. Anyone? Anyone? Fry? Oh. Definitely some interesting stories tonight. But anyway. Raid messages are available. It is extremely cheap to buy the emotes. At least I try to make them so. I think I technically gave everyone who was following me at the time 1,000 or more points. I don't know. If you lurk, there's no way you're not going to have enough. But thank you for coming in, Taka. Guess where we're going? But I guess I will see everyone next Thursday for the next story stream. Unless somehow I come in and do a game stream between then. So, have a good night, everyone.